single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. For the past several days, correction officers at prisons across the state have been on strike. Officers are calling for a full repeal of the HALT Act, which limits the use of solitary confinement in prisons. At the top of the week, Governor Kathy Hochul said that her administration has tried to negotiate, but would be moving forward with legal proceedings against the officers. By late Thursday, Hochul and the officers' union came to a tentative agreement, which meant a 90-day pause on the HALT Act. At this time, officers are reviewing the terms of that agreement. We'll continue to bring you updates on any developments with the strikes right here on the show. The prison strikes also come just a few weeks after an inmate was beaten to death by correction officers at Marcy Correctional Facility. That incident led to mass outrage from advocates and elected officials. To unpack the prison reform policies this year, here's our Elise Klein. And please be advised that the upcoming footage is graphic in nature.
In response to the violent and tragic death of Robert Brooks, an inmate at Marcy Correctional Facility in Oneida County, some state lawmakers have reintroduced legislation to address prison safety and public safety. The incident was investigated by the state for the use of excessive force by correction officers and nursing staff, which ultimately led to Brooks' death. So far, several officers have been charged with murder at a recent arraignment hearing following a grand jury indictment. Lawmakers like State Senator Julia Salazar, a Democrat representing parts of Brooklyn, and the chair of Crime Victims and Corrections Senate Committee are demanding justice.
As legislators, we have a responsibility to make prisons safer than this.
In January, Salazar reintroduced 3 bills intending to improve safety, accountability, and transparency in prisons. At a press conference, she condemned the mistreatment of inmates in state prisons, calling for change.
And we can ensure that New Yorkers entrusted to the state's care are treated with more dignity, more respect, and more compassion, not violently beaten to death with impunity.
Robert Ricks, Robert Brooks' father, recently traveled to the Capitol to talk to lawmakers and testify at a budget hearing about public protection. He says both the criminal justice system and the prison system are broken and need to be restructured.
So having experienced the trauma, the atrocity of seeing my son in a body bag and then seeing him beaten to death is sad, and it's painful, and it's hurtful, but it's also enraging. So for me, at this juncture, it's about change.
Rick says he's looked at many criminal justice reform bills, and he isn't sure they're enough to change the inequities in the system. Salazar says while these bills can't reform the entire system, they can still make needed changes.
Of course, we want to see a more comprehensive agenda. As Robert mentioned, we know that no singular bill or even set of bills can change the culture of violence and impunity in jails and prisons in New York, but it can play a role.
One of the bills, nicknamed the Docs Discipline Bill, intends to do this by authorizing the State Department of Corrections and Community Provision Commissioner authority to discipline officers alleged of engaged misconduct. Jennifer Scaife with the Correction Association of New York says this bill is common sense and a step towards increasing accountability.
If you run an organization and somebody breaks the rules or commits a crime, the person who runs that agency should have the power to decide that that person cannot work for their agency anymore.
Scaife adds in prisons currently there is a culture of impunity that needs to be addressed.
I think right now there is this kind of pervasive sense of impunity that some staff who work in the prisons feel that they are untouchable, that it's basically impossible to lose your job. So So we think that this bill would take some steps to begin changing that culture.
According to data originally obtained by the Marshall Project, when the state corrections department tried to use substantial evidence demonstrating abuse by prison guards to fire them, they failed 90% of the time. For example, the most recently obtained data going back to 2010 shows that docs tried to fire officers alleged to have engaged in the abuse or cover-up of abuse in at least 290 cases, but they were only successful in 28 of those cases. According to a 2023 report from docs, from 2018 to 2022, the Office of Special Investigations investigated 240 cases in which officers committed assaults. The report did not provide additional details on the outcomes of those cases. Senator Salazar says the docs discipline bill could help improve the number of successful firings. The current process of collective bargaining leaves the final say up to an arbitrator who is in part selected by the correction unions. Salazar says this existing process is what results in inadequate discipline in cases of misconduct and abuse.
Out of thousands of cases annually that docs seeks discipline, a very tiny fraction of them actually result in officers being fired. We know that 3 of the officers who were directly involved in the killing of Robert Brooks they previously faced discipline for permanently injuring incarcerated individuals, and that discipline was deeply inadequate. The fact that they were able to continue to work for the Department of Corrections and ultimately do what they did to Robert, that is a testament to the need for the disciplinary process to change.
The other 2 bills would establish new state entities to oversee the treatment of incarcerated individuals and mandate oversight reports by the nonprofit Correctional Association of New York and remove certain restrictions for conducting those reports. Scaife says one of the restrictions lifted through their bill would allow them to access data and records without having to file a Freedom of Information request. Scaife says currently the process of getting information takes significant periods of time, sometimes up to a year.
Which we think is really non-controversial and a basic standard for an oversight organization so that it understands what's going on and can make sense of what incarcerated people and staff are telling us when we are conducting monitoring visits.
All 3 prison reform bills failed to make it out of committee last year, which some lawmakers attribute to the sometimes tedious legislative process. Bills like this, trying to implement systematic changes, can also take several years to pass because of the level of stakeholders and the sheer volume of competing bills taken up each year. This year, however, some lawmakers feel there is increasing support and momentum for change following the death of Robert Brooks. Salazar says she is cautiously optimistic.
I feel very confident and encouraged by the support that we're seeing, also by conversations with the executive chamber about it.
Other lawmakers supportive of the legislation say they hope to see these bills pass. State Senator Zellner Myrie, a Democrat representing parts of Brooklyn, says the legislature needs to do everything it can to improve transparency and accountability in prisons.
What we saw was disgusting. This should never happen in a New York correctional facility, and we should be implementing every single protection we can to ensure that incarcerated individuals are never subjected to what Mr. Brooks was.
Some Republicans across the aisle agree there is an issue of violence in prisons, but they have different ideas about how to handle it. State Senator Anthony Palumbo, a Republican representing parts of Suffolk County, says the legislature needs to ensure there is proper funding and staffing for the Department of Corrections. Palumbo says a bill like the docs discipline bill might be an overstep.
That's a really difficult thing because you have a membership that is contractually bound to an agreement, and they usually bargain that stuff out through their collective bargaining with their union and the members and the governor or whoever it may be, depending on the agency. And so that's really kind of an important thing that I don't think we should get too invested in something like that and micromanaging an agency like that.
Other Republicans stress addressing the issue starts with improving staffing in prisons. State Senator Patrick Gallivan, a Republican representing parts of Erie County, says he is concerned about deteriorating staffing levels.
The answer does not lie in just altering correction officers' behavior. It's fixing the issue of violence in prisons, and we start by properly equipping them, ensure, again, proper level, sufficient staffing, select the right people, properly train them, properly equip them.
While some Democrats say they don't think it's accurate to source staffing as a reason for violence in prisons, there are ways to deal with the staffing issue. one of them being to close prisons. Assembly member DeMond Meeks, a Democrat representing parts of Rochester, says to his understanding, the state has the ability to close several prisons, a measure approved in last year's final budget. He also stands with his colleagues calling to close Marcy Correctional Facility.
This isn't a one and done. They have a track record. So do other facilities across the state, but a track record of brutality, and it's unacceptable.
For many advocates also calling for the closure of Marcy and demanding justice, this issue is personal. Stanley Bellany, a community organizer for RAP, the Release Aging People in Prison or RAP campaign, says this issue means a lot to him, having served 37 and a half years in prison. He says he has seen officer brutality and inhumane treatment firsthand.
I have watched officers murder incarcerated people and no accountability. Only thing for some of them, they was asked to leave their job. They was never arrested, they was never charged, there was never any penalized whatsoever. And that's why this issue is very important to me, because I still have family members that's incarcerated that will be subject to the same type of behavior if it's not addressed and changed.
Bellany's experience in prison stays with him even now that he is out.
I did 37 and a half years, and I'm still coping with that system that I left, and I've only been home 20 months. So it's traumatizing.
Bellany isn't alone. Advocate Thomas Gant, who served 25 years in prison, says after just seeing parts of the released video of Robert Brooks, he had nightmares.
My wife had to shove me awake 2 nights in a row. I was in my sleep crying, right? And you know, moaning and doing all these having these different reactions. So it's a subconscious thing for me. So my trauma goes deep. As you can imagine, 25 years of that, of being treated less than, of, you know, not being afforded an opportunity to walk with dignity, respect, and my humanness, right? And so that does something to you.
The conditions of the prison system aren't just hard on inmates and formerly incarcerated individuals. It's also hard on the families. Caroline Hansen, a community leader for RAP, says she worries about her husband currently serving life without parole all the time.
I live in fear every day when that phone rings that he could be the next Robert Brooks. We have 2 daughters, and I think about Robert Brooks's family, his mother, his children, and it breaks my heart.
Because of her experience, Hansen is passionate, like many others, about advocating for change. For a recent press conference in Albany, she woke up at 4 a.m. to get to the Capitol for an afternoon rally. This is an issue advocates like Hansen have been rallying for a long time. Bellany stresses this incident in particular has gained a lot of attention because it was caught on camera.
The only reason why this is an issue now because the whole world got to see it. But we've been telling them this been going on for years and nothing has been happening or done to change it. And that's the most important thing. Something needs to be done. For many of us that formerly incarcerated, this is our George Floyd moment.
Body cameras are a topic of budget discussions. It came up often in a recent budget hearing focusing on public protection. The governor proposed in her budget $400 million for the acceleration and continued installation of fixed cameras in all facilities and $18.4 million for the expansion of the body-worn camera program. Docs Commissioner Daniel Marticello, when asked a question during the recent budget hearing about what should be done to improve the disciplinary process, says cameras have helped tremendously. However, while many lawmakers on both sides of the aisle say they are supportive of this budget item, some lawmakers say there has to be better enforcement of the use of the cameras.
It's very important to have a universal body-worn camera policy. It's important to have fixed cameras adequate across facilities. And so I support the funding to ensure that that happens. At the same time, there need to be consequences when the policy is not followed.
Marcel said in the hearing he is focused on accountability and reiterated his condemnation of the excessive force used against Robert Brooks. Some lawmakers were not happy with his answers during the hearing. State Senator Jabari Brisport, a Democrat representing parts of Brooklyn, says while the Dogs Commissioner stressed a focus on accountability, he seems to have neglected making changes around this very issue for years at this point.
I would say one of the most frustrating things that I brought up when I was questioning him was that in his opening statements, he had a slew of reforms they were talking about implementing in the wake of Robert Brooks's murder. And that begs the question, why wasn't any of this done before?
WMHC reached out multiple times to docs to ask further questions, but they declined to comment. WMHC also tried to talk to the commissioner and ask further questions about the state's handling of Robert Brooks' death and other misconduct after the public protection hearing, but Marticello evaded reporters, swiftly trying to exit the building. It's clear this issue will continue to be on lawmakers' minds as session moves along. Again, these bills are still in committee, but many lawmakers say if the political will is there, they will pass. So far, that will seems to be present. Elise Klein, New York Now.
Now turning to another important topic. Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas is pushing for a bill that would require insurance coverage for inhalers in the state budget. If enacted, the Department of Financial Services would then be tasked with monitoring their compliance. To unpack the bill and the support around it, we sat down with the Assembly member. Here's that interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Assembly member.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I'm so excited to talk about your bill that would require insurance coverage for inhalers at no cost. Can you tell us some insight into that bill and why it was important for you to sponsor it?
Yes, so right now in New York, we have over 1 million people who live with asthma, 300,000 children. And we know that the inhalers are a life-saving device. Like, they literally cannot go without it. And last year in our budget, we were able to pass a bill in the budget that was sponsored by Assemblywoman Farah Soufran Forrest that included insulin without cost. So this means that there's no copay, no coinsurance, no deductible to cover this life-saving device, which is insulin. So I was really inspired by that bill. I also represent Asthma Alley in Queens. I have North Astoria in my district. My Senate partner is Senator Rivera, who has the Bronx, and Bronx is notoriously suffers with the high asthma rates. Also in Queens and South Queens, there's high asthma rates as well. So it's something that impacts my community personally, my Senate sponsors community personally. So we're really invested in not just lowering the cost for inhalers, but getting rid of copays, coinsurance, and deductibles completely. This is a life-saving device, and it shouldn't cost so much to breathe.
And given the time we're in where we're seeing, record high inflation and rising costs of groceries, what are you hearing from constituents about how paying for things like inhalers is impacting their pockets and their livelihood?
Yeah, we were really inspired by activist friends of mine who have children. They were paying $200 per child for these inhalers whenever they needed it. And that cost was such a burden on the rising costs of food and rent and all the things that everyday New Yorkers are struggling with. So to hear her story, to see how she's struggling to make ends meet, and acknowledging that these children need their inhalers, right, to breathe. And it is just so critical to the health and well-being of our children, of our community, that those stories inspired me to introduce the bill, in addition to having and seeing the data around the high rates of asthma in my district and in Queens and in the Bronx and across the state, really.
And it's clear that affordability is the big theme this session. So I wanted to get your take on, if the governor and legislative leaders are in line with your vision for lowering or eliminating the cost of inhalers for New Yorkers. Do you think that they're fully behind this measure?
Well, we were meeting with the governor's office about it. We were hoping it would be in the budget, so it hasn't yet emerged, but it's still not too late. We are in the throes of budget negotiations. And again, we were really thrilled that she was able to do this for insulin last year, and it was something that she touted and was very proud of. That is probably saving lives. And we want to save lives as well, and making sure that folks who live with asthma are able to get these life-saving devices without cost. So it seems aligned with her vision of affordability for New Yorkers, and obviously health and well-being is so central to that. And people, again, shouldn't have to pay hundreds of dollars. We hear costs up to $640 for an inhaler, just one inhaler. So these are costs that no one should bear in order to breathe. It's a vital life function, and we want to make sure every New Yorker is healthy, and this is one way to do that.
And what are your current conversations like with your fellow lawmakers in the Assembly chamber about this measure?
We're really excited. I mean, we got a lot of support. We hit the ground running in the summer with this bill. The mayor of Rochester just came up to Albany to testify last week. We acknowledged that the rates of asthma in Rochester have skyrocketed, and he supports the bill and already issued a memo of support. for this bill. So we were thrilled to, not just talk to our direct colleagues, but also other public officials that are dealing with these, high rates of asthma in their communities and want to make sure that their communities have access to those life-saving devices. So that was really wonderful. So we're pushing along, we're gaining co-sponsors, and again, meeting with the governor's office to hope that she would include this in the final budget.
Are we anticipating any cost for the state to have that monitoring?
It would really just, it's the companies that make it, right? So we hear of these big companies like AstraZeneca or GlaxoSmithKline, where they're charging hundreds of dollars in the United States, but charging $9 or $14 in Europe or Germany, right? Yeah. So it's really just having them not make profit off these kind of life-saving devices. So we don't anticipate really a cost to the state. It's really the insurance companies that would just have to provide this as part of their insurance packages.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, the State Department reported that over 1.5 million New Yorkers struggle with asthma. Mm-hmm. So from your purview, why hasn't something like this been put into place to help New Yorkers?
Well, we have to continue to fight. It's public health advocates like myself, like Senator Rivera, that are really thinking about the impact of the costs of care for New Yorkers who are struggling. The other thing to note is the 300,000 children that are struggling with asthma and often missing days from school and again, not being able to participate, play outside, do things that normal children should be able to do because they don't have access to their inhalers. So this is about both affordability and public health.
Yeah, and there are some other states who have similar measures, such as Minnesota, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Illinois. So I was curious, how would the New York law be different or similar from what has been put forth in those other states?
So those states have capped the cost, which is great. I think between $25 and $35. But here in New York, our bill would make this totally free to the patients so that they're not paying any deductible, any co-pays, no co-insurance. So that's how we're different because, again, we want to lead in these areas and we want to be the best advocates for the health and well-being of our New Yorkers. And it's wonderful that other states have done it, but we certainly should get ahead and be the state out front and ensuring that every person has access to these life-saving devices for free.
Absolutely. And lastly, we're about 2 months into the session. We're thick into budget negotiations. So what will be your strategy to ensure that, this makes it into the final enacted budget and this isn't a lost priority at the Capitol?
Yeah, so we're circulating a letter to our colleagues. Again, we have members and sponsors on the bill. We're continuing our conversations with the governor's office. And we're just working to do education. And again, just the inspiration of what happened last year with the insulin bill. Again, it's just really, really critical that we look at other life-saving devices. Again, this is something that someone needs to breathe. And as we say, it shouldn't cost so much to breathe. So this would be something that could really help everyday New Yorkers be well, be healthy in the state. And we have a lot of support. It's just continuing to push in a time where, the future is uncertain in terms of the federal government. But I know in New York, we really want to address affordability and the health and well-being of our neighbors.
Well, it sounds like a lot to look forward to. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Assemblymember.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And we were speaking with Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. Now turning to our last topic, where we'll be diving into the impactful work of a community leader in the Capital Region. For years, Eva Bass has worked to provide opportunities, support, and resources to her community with her nonprofit organizations. That work is done in part through an organization known as Bridge the Gap, which strives to address systemic service gaps. Here's that story.
Today, if you're just coming in or if you don't realize what's going on, this is our second annual State of the Community address.
My name is Eva Bass, and I'm the CEO and founder of Bridge the Gap Resource and Outreach Incorporated, and I am the executive director of A Village, Inc. Bridge the Gap is a community-based organization that focuses on helping people have the tools to be their best self. We do that by mentorship, but also bringing resources closer to the community.
We've been here for 1 year. Yeah. Woo! That's what I'm talking about.
I came to this work because of my life experiences. I grew up in foster care. I grew up in a house of mental health issues, and I've been on my own since I was 14. I'm a single mom. I've been through domestic violence, like all of those things. I just chose to change my pain and my story into a solution for others. The way I lead is side by side with the community, with my partners, and with my staff, with my volunteers. I always remind them, I'm just Miss Eva. I'm here. I came from the same place as you came, and we're doing this for us as a collective versus for some kind of personal agenda.
I really appreciate you guys taking this time out to really hear what's going on.
So in my long line of work, I have had to fight so hard to just convince people the real needs of the community.
We have done a community impact survey, and now we have the facts to hold people accountable.
I took a step back and I made a commitment to make sure that we created some data-based information so that we can steer our own services that we provide, but also hold other organizations, government officials, and leaders accountable to make sure they're prioritizing the real needs of the community. My hope is just seeing that we're providing a service for our community to be able to have a safe haven where they can be their authentic self, and they're not being judged. But when they walk in the Bridge the Gap, it feels like home.
Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,